Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. I think it's near enough to 11:30, so we'll get ready to make a start on the next talk. I'm Colin Prosser. I'm a past president of the Geologists Association, and I'm currently responsible for conservation within the Geologists Association, and I'm an editor of PGA. And I've got with me Nick Pierpoint, our previous president and current senior vice president, who is here to assist should there be any technical issues and I'd get cut off or disappear. So welcome to the second talk of our first virtual Festival of Geology. The talk is by Dr. Tim Newman. Tim's got many years of experience working as a geologist, ranging from gold exploration in Australia through to mining geology in Botswana, and more recently as a geotechnical engineer on a whole range of projects across England. The title of the talk, and it's a little bit of a tongue twister, is The Tideway London Thames Tideway Tunnel, a window to the geology beneath the River Thames. So if we're set up and ready, let's move on and start the talk. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Tim Newman and I'm the project geologist for the Thames Tideway Tunnel. I'm going to be talking to you about the geology that we've encountered during construction of the tunnel beneath the River Thames in central London. But more specifically, I'm going to be talking to you about how the geology has affected the design of the tunnel, and also how the geology has presented challenges for the excavation. So to begin with, just a little bit of a background. The tunnel is a 25-kilometre long stormwater storage tunnel. It's got an internal diameter of 7.2 metres. It was devised in the early 1990s, and its aim is to clean up the River Thames by capturing the 39 million tonnes of raw sewage that is discharged into the river every year when the existing sewer network becomes inundated during periods of heavy rainfall. The photo on the left there is what we call a combined sewer overflow, commonly abbreviated to CSO. These are points in the river wall where the sewage is discharged into the river from the existing sewer network. There's about one discharge on average every week throughout the year, and with every discharge you can imagine the considerable damage to the River Thames ecological system. So this is a simplified route of the tunnel. As I say, it's a 25-kilometre long stormwater storage tunnel. It starts over in West London, in Acton, at about 30 metres below ground level. And then it follows the course of the River Thames through central London and then veers northeastwards towards Thames Water's Abbey Mills pumping station. And here it attains a depth of about 65 metres below ground level. At this point, it connects to the existing Lee Tunnel and continues its journey to Beckton, the Thames Water Beckton sewage treatment works. The small symbols here, the small circle symbols, are shafts that we have constructed. These are Cso shafts, and they've been constructed to capture the outflows from the existing sewers, and they will divert the sewage to the tunnel at depth. Now, because the tunnel is on a west-east gradient, all the sewage that flows into it continues flowing under gravity towards Abbey Mills and then continues flowing towards the Beckton sewage treatment works, where it's pumped from a depth of about 85 metres below ground level. So it's pumped out to the surface and treated in the upgraded sewage treatment works there. There are 17 of these Cso shafts in total. The bigger symbols, the bigger circle symbols here, 3 of them, these are the main construction shafts. They're huge structures. They're over 30 meters in diameter. And these have been constructed to facilitate the installation of the Tbms, or the tunnel boring machines that will mine the main tunnel itself. 25 kilometers in length is too big to conduct as a single contract, so we split it up into 3. In the west contract, the main tunnel, well, that's actually been completed. That runs between Carnwath Road and Fulham and Acton. There's also a smaller 3-meter diameter stub tunnel connecting King George's Park in Wandsworth back towards Carnwath Road. In the central, there are 2 main tunnel drives. The first one is from Curtning Street in Battersea to Carnwath Road. That's more or less complete. The second one is from Curtning Street eastwards to the Chambers Wharf site in Bermondsey. That's almost complete. It's got another 500 meters to complete. It should be done before Christmas. It's just gone past Tower Bridge. In the east, tunneling hasn't quite started yet. It will start very soon, actually. The main tunnel drive continues from Chambers Wharf in Bermondsey northeastwards to complete the link at Abbey Mills. In the east, there's also a not so small stub tunnel which runs across the Rotherhithe Peninsula. This is called the Greenwich Connection Tunnel, which connects the Greenwich pumping station to Chambers Wharf. To put things into perspective, we're looking at a slice through the River Thames now. It shows us the engineering design. Typically, we have the existing sewer that runs beneath the river embankment, discharging the sewage into the River Thames. Well, we've built an interception chamber at each one of these locations that captures this sewage discharge and diverts it into each one of the shafts. Here the sewage drops to the bottom of the shaft and then is diverted by a small diameter connection tunnel into the main tunnel. Remember, this has an internal diameter of 7.2 meters, or an external cut diameter of about 8.3, 8.4 meters. So it's a big tunnel. And just to put that in perspective, I'll draw your attention to the little symbol on the right here. A bit of a frivolous fact: you can fit 3 London double-decker buses inside this tunnel if you wanted to. Perhaps it's a good way to beat the traffic, but not when it's full of stormwater. This is an aerial view of the shaft, one of the shafts, this one at Blackfriars Bridge. In case you're wondering how we actually get some of these shafts into the river foreshore, well, we construct a steel sheet pile cofferdam into the river first of all, and then pump out all the water. This makes a seal against the water flowing in, so we can construct the shaft in the dry. Not all of the shafts have been excavated in the river foreshore. Some have been completed on land, others have been in the foreshore. So there's about a half and half mix. But before we start sinking shafts or driving tunnels, we have to investigate the ground. We have to know the ground that we are going to be excavating through. And to this effect, we've excavated or constructed nearly 500 investigation boreholes. Nearly 100 of these have been constructed in the river itself. And this is a photo of a rig, a drilling rig, that's been floated into position and then jacked up on these 4 legs, enabling the borehole to be drilled in position in the river. So nearly 500 boreholes in total, and this is what we get from these boreholes. Rotary core. This shows the London Basin geological sequence recovered from one particular borehole. The top of the borehole is on the left here, and the bottom is on the right here. This is a solid geological sequence. It doesn't include the superficial deposits, the man-made ground, the alluvium, and the river terrace deposits. They sit on the top of the borehole here, but we can't core through this material. We usually get them recovered as bulk bags of material, and I'll go through those in due course. But following good practice, we start from the bottom upwards in the London Basin boreholes. So at the bottom, we've got the white chalk subgroup. Chalk is a soft, pure white limestone. It was deposited up to 65 million years ago in a deep sea that covered southeast England. You can see the prevalence of harder layers of flint, and I'll talk about the discrepancy between chalk and flint in due course. But a lot of the top of the chalk has been eroded, so what we've actually got here is about 84 million years old. On top of the chalk, we have the Thanet Sand, which lies unconformably on this. The Thanet Sand is about 15 meters thick in the east of London, tapering to about 7 meters thick in the west. It's a silty fine sand. And then on top of the Thanet Sand, we've got the Lambeth group deposits. These too lie unconformably on the Thanet formation. They're about 17 to 18 meters thick on average across London, and they were formed or deposited between about 56 and 52 million years ago. But they typify changing eustatic sea level changes and the effect this had on the type of sediments that were deposited. At the base, we've got the Upnor Formation. This is deposited about 56 million years ago in a shallow sea that transgressed over southeast England. Then there was a sea level fall and the emergence of terrestrial conditions. And then the lower mottle beds were deposited in a fluviatile environment, exposed to pedogenic processes. We can see here they're heavily weathered, heavily oxidized, oranges and browns. Notice the formation of a jury crust. This is calcrete at the top of the lower mottle beds. This was formed during a major sea level fall across the entire region, and this facilitated the formation of this jury crust here. The top of the lower mottle beds, actually this point here, the junction between the lower mottle beds and the overlying lower Shelley beds, we call this the mid-Lambeth Hiatus. And this is a really important marker horizon which we use in geological modelling. So the lower Shelley beds marks the emergence of lagoonal, brackish lagoonal conditions associated with a slight sea level rise. These were low energy conditions with typically poor current circulation and the deposition of dark grey to black clays, but they're packed full of shells. And then they gave way to the laminated beds, which reflect more estuarine conditions. I'm going to jump this sand channel here and just say that the upper mottle beds and the upper Shelley beds, they reflect a repetition of the conditions, a sea level fall to produce the upper mottle beds, and then the return of brackish lagoonal conditions for the upper Shelley beds. But we can notice this yellow-brown pure sand at the junction between the upper mottle beds and laminated beds. This is a relict river channel, and there were lots of these that flowed across London, across the upper mottle bed landscape, and they cut down into the sequence. It reflects an old river channel. It's basically a fossil river, if you like, full of this pure sand. On top of the Lambeth group, we've got the Thames group, and this comprises predominantly the London clay and a thin layer of Harwich formation at the base. We'll talk about those in due course. But before I move on, just a little bit about the groundwater contained within this sequence. Groundwater is possibly, or arguably, the #1 enemy of tunnellers. You can't tunnel in wet ground, so often we have to dewater the ground by various techniques before we can tunnel in the dry. We've got London's lower aquifer in the chalk here. This is where we get a lot of our drinking water from. Then we have an intermediate aquifer in the sand channel deposits. These are full of groundwater, often at high pressure. And then we have an upper aquifer that's contained within the sands and the gravels of the river terrace deposits that sit on top of the impermeable London clay. So moving on, this is a geological long section. We use the boreholes to construct this across the scheme. We can see here the tunnel is superimposed over the geology in long section. And from this we can see that the tunnel has been constructed in 9 kilometres of London clay over in the west. In the central, we've got about 7 kilometres of tunnel in the Lambeth group deposits, and then a smaller 3 kilometre section in mixed London clay and Lambeth group. And then over in the east, tunnelling or underground construction is entirely within the chalk. So if you like, coincidentally, the west, central and east contracts are divided up into separate geological domains: chalk, Lambeth group and London clay. And this has had an effect on much of the design of the tunnel, not just the machinery, but the way that the shafts have been sunk through the ground. In the west, most of the shafts have been constructed using bored concrete piles. These have been driven into the ground, seated into the London clay, effectively sealing off the groundwater in the river terrace deposits, the upper aquifer. Once these piles have been put in place, then we are free to excavate the material inside the piles, so we can sink the shaft using this technique and dig out the ground within the completed concrete pile structure. In the cofferdams, there's no need to put piles in because the sheet steel piles have actually cut off the river water already. So we're free to construct the shaft using precast concrete segments. These are put in place on the surface and then pushed down into the ground using these jacking mechanisms at the surface. So at the base we've got a steel cutting ring, and at the top we push the rings into the ground. The idea is that the technique allows for or ensures that there are less personnel actually in the shaft, so it's improvements in health and safety, if you like. We can see here a digging machine digging out the ground within the completed ring structure. Now, both the concrete board piles and the concrete ring segments have a limited depth. They can't go beyond a certain depth. So this is where the sprayed concrete lining, or SCL technique, takes over. Quite simply, it's where we cut the ground out and we spray concrete on it. This concrete we term shotcrete, actually. It's a very flexible technique, and most of the short connection tunnels have been constructed using this technique. Now, over in the east, the shaft sinking techniques that we've seen just aren't efficient enough in the chalk. And so here we use the diaphragm wall technique. A little bit similar, but not too similar. We use a giant rig called a hydrophrase, and we can see here two teeth or mechanisms on the end of a large boom. This is lowered into the ground and cuts a series of panels in the ground. And then these panels are backfilled with concrete and steel reinforcement, as we see here. They form an interlocking circle around the shaft footprint, and then we can dig the ground out inside this core. Incidentally, these panels, we can excavate them or construct them to 90 meters in depth and more if we need to. So with all of these shaft sinking techniques, the structure is formed in the ground before the actual excavation of the ground in the core. And here we see the excavation of the material or the ground using a 360-degree excavator with a toothed bucket to dig the ground. And this is when we geologists, we go in the shaft and we record the ground as it's being dug out. So you can imagine these shafts are like giant boreholes, and we can get a lot more detailed information on the geology when compared to a 100mm diameter borehole. So the ground is dug out, placed into a skip, and the skip is hoisted to surface via a crane here, as we see. Needless to say, the deeper the shaft goes, the longer it takes to hoist the spoil, as we call it, out to the surface. And incidentally, most of the spoil has been transported away from the site. In fact, all of the spoil has, by the river barges. So we've kept lorries off the streets. So I'm going to go through the geology that we've encountered when we've sunk these shafts across London. Obviously, I can't start from the bottom like we do at the boreholes, so I have to start at the top. And this is in the made ground, the man-made deposits, usually building rubble that's been backfilled or spread onto the ground. This is more of interest to our archaeologist friends. There are lots of archaeologists who've been involved in the Tideway project, and they've come from the Museum of London. This is a scene from the Chambers Wharf site in Bermondsey, and we can see that we found several skeletons. There was a lot of activity on the riverfront back in the medieval ages. In the top right, we see a pocket sundial. This was used by 17th century mariners in their quest to explore the world. And in the bottom right, we've got a Roman coin. We've actually found several of these. And I'm reliably informed by the archaeologists that while some have the head of Julius Caesar on, he was the emperor of the Western Empire, others have the head of Cornelius on. He was the emperor of the Eastern Empire. And the fact that we've got both of these coins, Caesar's head and Cornelius's head, on the same location proves that the currencies were interchangeable. Beneath the made ground, we've got alluvium. This goes back to about 10,000 years and represents the interface between archaeologists and geologists. As far as the archaeologists are concerned, the Museum of London, they're conducting the Battersea Channel project. The idea is that back in the Neolithic times, the River Thames was not a single channel as it is today, but instead a series of smaller channels separated by higher land, known as eyots, in between. This is one example of a channel feature that's been unearthed in the Kirtling Street site at Battersea. And here we see on the top right the interlayering between sandy and more clay-rich layers. Gives a good indication of the changing energy conditions that were taking place about 10,000 years ago. On the bottom right, here we have a Neolithic fish trap. The ancient people that lived during these times, they survived mainly by fishing. And this is quite a an interesting device. They would construct these structures made of wood and wattle across the mouths of some of the smaller channels. The idea is that during high tide, the fish and the water were able to flow past these structures, but during the ebb of the tide, at low tide, the fish would be trapped on one side of these structures, and the water was allowed to drain out. So quite clever devices, considering the age of them. Now we move on to the river terrace deposits. These were deposited at the end of the last ice age, from about 2 million years ago to up to about 11,500 years ago. Now, as I've said, we can't get rotary core through these materials. They're mainly sands and gravels. Normally what we get is just a bulk bag of disturbed material. So this is an example of the stratification that we see in the river terrace deposits, reflecting the changing energy conditions. We've got the river terrace deposits actually preserved as a karst on the inside of the D-wall mechanisms here in some of the eastern shafts. We can see the interlayering between more sandy, gravelly material compared to more pure sands, and then back into sandy gravels. So there were changing energy conditions during the deposition of the river terrace deposits. Similarly, we see the contact of the river terrace deposits with the underlying solid geology. We don't see these in boreholes. We don't get this recovery. So we learn a lot by logging the geology within the shafts. We see stuff that we don't see in boreholes. On the left, we've got an example of the sands and gravels overlying, or their contact with the underlying London clay. That's typical over most of the project. Over in the east, we see the sands and gravels, their contact with the underlying Thanet Sand. This was very exciting. We just don't get this in boreholes, so it's very interesting to see it exposed in the shaft excavations. So now we come on to the solid geology, at the top of which we have the London clay formation, the bulk of the Thames group. On the left, we've got the typical London clay. It's typically a brownish, silty clay. It's actually the tunneler's favourite tunnelling medium. We'll find that most of London's tunnels have been constructed in the London clay. This is because it's soft enough to dig out very easily, but stiff enough material to hold its circular profile after excavation, long enough for the application of the tunnel lining, the temporary lining, which in this case is shotcrete. Because most of London's tunnels are already in the London clay, this is the reason why the Tideway tunnel is so deep. You know, we've had to go deep enough to avoid all the pre-existing tunnel structures. This is a sample of the Harwich Formation, a thin layer or stratum at the base of the Thames group, lying below the London clay. It's typically more earthy in appearance than the London clay, and a lot more sandy. And notice the green hue. This is because it contains glauconite. It's also got some gravel, some flint gravel in it, and broken shell fragments. But a very thin stratum, typically between about 200 and 400 millimeters thick. Now we come on to the Lambeth group, and things change here. Excavation is not so straightforward, because now we encounter frequent hard bands of cemented ground, and we can see here a lot of this needs to be broken out with a hydraulic breaker there we see on the left. This is the top of the Lambeth group, the upper Shelley beds, and we see here we're breaking out a cemented shell layer. The upper Shelley beds are typically between about 1.5 to 1.6 meters thick, but we have an incredible amount of variation of lithology within this relatively small stratum of material. We've got there we have laminated dark clays with fine sands and silts. We've got Shelley clay material. We've got strong cemented mudstone layers, and then another cemented shell coquina at the base of the deposit. So a lot of variation over a very short space of time, perhaps. This is a short video clip of the Tbm launch adit at the Kirtling Street site in Battersea. It shows the London clay over the upper Shelley beds here. You can see the top coquina, or the cemented shell layer, the bottom shell layer, and the layering effect in the upper Shelley beds. Notice how this big machine is not having its own way. It's struggling on some of the harder layers within the upper Shelley beds. There's a lot of crunching of the harder rock going on. Now compare it to how easily it digs out the London clay, like a knife through soft butter. So beneath the upper Shelley beds, we've got the upper grey clay, but strongly mottled with oranges, reds, and brown colorations. This is a very good tunneling medium as per the London clay. It's a very stiff clay and gives a good stand-up time when excavating some of the short connection tunnels. Now we come to the sand channels. I mentioned they're full of water. These are our intermediate aquifer. We can't sink shafts when these are full of water. We have to dewater them. So this is usually done by constructing boreholes from the surface that pump out the groundwater within the sand channels before we actually start sinking a shaft. We have to install more specialist vacuum dewatering wells when we get closer to the sand channels, and these two pump out any residual water and pump it to surface. It's not always easy to get rid of all the water in these sand channels, and so there's a lot of residual water left within the sand channels, and this causes problems during construction. We can see here the picture on the right is during construction of the launch chamber, the Tbm launch chamber at the Kirtling Street site, and the difficulty of spraying shotcrete onto wet sand. It just won't stick. So this leads to an alteration of the shotcrete mix. We have to put more additives in to make it stick to the wet sand a bit better than it does in this example. Elsewhere, we've had sand channels in the crown of some of the smaller diameter connection tunnels. Not only do we pump the water out before we begin excavation, but we, in this case, have installed a pipe arch, a series of pipes that are driven into the side of the shaft prior to excavation, and they pump in a grout, a resin grout that, if you like, glues up the sand and prevents it from collapsing when driving the tunnel. You can see here the picture of the right how the sand has been bound together by the grouting process. So a lot of challenges presented by these sand channels, but with good engineering we can overcome these challenges. Good engineering and ground treatment. Not only is groundwater a problem in the sand channels, but we've also encountered layers of very strong sandstone. But with a good borehole investigation, these we knew about these in advance, and so we can order in the right equipment in order to excavate this material when we come across it during shaft sinking or excavation of the Tbm launch adits. Moving further down the sequence, we now see examples of the laminated beds on the left here and the lower Shelley beds on the right. They haven't really caused us any problems. They're quite easy to excavate and have a good stand-up time prior to application of tunnel primary lining support. The picture on the right now is a good example of what our mid-Lambeth hiatus looks like when exposed in a tunnel drive. On the left here, this is an example of what a connection tunnel looks like at the base of the shaft. Typically, we've got the calcrete at the top of the lower mottle beds here in this example on the right, overlain by the lower Shelley beds. So whilst we're on this, we can talk a little bit about the lower mottle beds. Very similar to the upper mottle beds, a very stiff clay, showing evidence of very intense pedogenic subaerial weathering here. The difference between the lower mottle beds and the upper mottle beds is that the lower mottle beds shows more evidence of more intense pedogenic weathering. We have more purples and deep reds in this deposit compared to the lighter browns and paler oranges in the upper mottle beds. But a very good tunneling medium. It's a stiff clay with a not too hard to dig out, but soft, but stiff enough to maintain tunnel profiles. I put this slide in just to show you the what happens when we complete these small connection tunnels. The picture on the left shows here this is its interface with the main tunnel. This is the concrete rings that we use to build the main tunnel. Eventually this will be broken out when we complete the main tunnel drive from Kirtling Street to Chambers Wharf. As I say, it's got another 500 meters to go, so we can't break through into the main tunnel yet, not until that tunnel drive has been completed. And we see here on the right in profile. Back to the geology, we've got the Upnor Formation, the basal stratum of the Lambeth group. It's typically a slightly clay, very gravelly sand, but you'll notice the quite distinct green colour that it has, and this is due to the inclusion of the mineral glauconite, a potassium iron silicate. It's typically dark green in colour. And there's anything up to about 30% of glauconite in the Upnor Formation, and this is where it gets its green colour from. However, we do know that the Upnor Formation is a hazardous stratum in its own right. I draw your attention to the well-documented case back in the 1980s where two very young engineers died from asphyxiation during tunnel construction of the Thames Water Ring Main in the Upnor Formation. We know that it oxidizes, particularly during or after dewatering of the ground, where the oxygen is replaced by nitrogen, sometimes up to 98% nitrogen and less than 2% oxygen. And we know that we need a good 21% oxygen in our atmosphere for us to survive. This is a picture of that we saw when on tideway during the core logging process, and you can see here this oxidization process. We see here the change from this typical teal blue-green color that the Upnor Formation usually represents, and it's being oxidized before our very own eyes into this dirty yellow-grey color. A couple of our boreholes actually encountered hypoxic or nitrogen-rich gas within the Upnor Formation. This shows gas escaping from a borehole that intersected the Upnor Formation on one of our river boreholes. Of course, the escape of gas was a lot more violent than this, but it just shows by placing a plastic bag over the top of the borehole casing, you can see the effect of the escaping gas. So a significant hazard for underground construction, particularly after dewatering. We've done a lot of research into this phenomenon. This is just one of a very simple experiment to show the effect of the rate of gas production. By placing a sample of Upnor Formation with a gas monitor or oxygen monitor within a sealed desiccator, we can see how the rate of oxygen decreases from 21% to near fatal levels, and then very fatal levels after a short space of time. So fortunately, the tunneling industry has taken this hazard on board, and now where we have excavation within the Upner Formation, there are very strict tunnel and shaft entry procedures before anyone can enter the works, and a robust gas monitoring system set in place. This is a gas monitor on the right here. We have continuous gas monitoring of the ground during excavation in the Upner Formation. Moving further down beyond the Lambeth group, we come into the Thanet Formation, and primarily composed of the Thanet Sand. And I have to confess, it's a fairly monotonous stratum to sink a shaft through. Very homogeneous material with not much change. Most of the excitement is at the contacts with the overlying Upner Formation and underlying chalk. On the left here, we see the contact of the Thanet Sand with the Upner Formation, and we can see a lot of burrowing that's taken place, burrowing from the Upner Formation into the Thanet Sand. You can see here these Upner Formation filled burrows that extend down into the Thanet Sand. At the base of the Thanet Sand, we have what we term the bullhead bed. We didn't see it in the core earlier on because it's usually not recovered. Rotary core bores are not very good at recovering gravel material, but in the shaft excavation, we can see it perfectly. It's about 200 to 300 millimeters thickness of this dense, coarse, angular flint gravel in a clay matrix, and it sits on top of the chalk. And now we're onto the chalk. We can talk a little bit about the way the flint layers are interspersed throughout this medium. Chalk in itself is a soft rock, as I say. It's got a compressive strength of between about 3 and 5 megapascal. Now compare that to the flint, which has got a compressive strength of anything up to 900 megapascal. So there's a huge variation in the strengths of these two materials. We can see here the flint seams, or the nodules of flint, form layers within the chalk, and these extend for kilometers. But we can see here it perfectly exposed in the Tbm adit at the Chambers Wharf shaft at Bermondsey. A small video clip just to show the excavation of the Chambers Wharf Tbm launch adit. You can see the machine here cutting very easily through the chalk, but not so easily through the flint gravel. Similar to the cemented layers in the upper Shelley beds, the flint seams in the chalk cause a bit of resistance to excavation. It would be very easy if it was just chalk. We can't have it all our own way. This is a photo of a geologist hard at work logging the chalk. It's very important to record the number of flint seams, and from this we can get an estimate of the percentage of the tunnel face that will be in this flint material, and from this we can design the cutting head of the Tbms that will be lowered into the ground. And talking of the Tbms, these are two examples of the 4 main tunnel Tbms that have been used to drive the tunnels. On the left, we've got Tbma, or more affectionately known as Rachel. She's completed the length of main tunnel between Carnworth Road in Fulham and Acton. She's been driven entirely through the London clay. Now compare the cutting head on Rachel to the cutting head on Ursula, Tbmc, who's just currently gone past the Tower Bridge, is making her way towards Chambers Wharf in Bermondsey. She's had to go through the more unstable ground of the Lambeth group. There's a risk of collapsing ground from the waterlogged sand channels. There are hard bands of material, as we've seen. And just look at the armour plating and more closed spacing arrangement of her cutting head compared to Rachel. more open design, because she doesn't have to encounter any hazardous ground conditions in the London clay. Just a little bit about some of the cutting tools that we put on top of the, or on the face of the cutting head. We've got ripping teeth here to rip out blocks of material. And we've got cutting teeth to scour away the clay. And then we've got roller discs. These are put on the cutting head to cut the harder layers of rock. All of these cutting tools are interchangeable, so we can take them out from inside the machine and change them. We can change, say, ripping teeth with cutting discs if need be, all depending on the ground we're going through. So this is a photo of Ursula being lowered into the shaft at the Kirtling Street site in Battersea. We can see here the completed launch chamber. She'll be lowered down here and put into place. Actually putting one of these Tbms into the shaft is a lengthy process. It takes a good day to lower her down on these high tension steel cables. Now, once in the ground, we can see this is a view looking back from the cutter head towards the back of the Tbm. The cutter head spins around in the ground and cuts the ground, and we see here the construction of concrete rings at the back of the machine. And the machine pushes itself forward on these completed rings via these hydraulic jacks that push the machine forward. Now, we've seen in the Lambeth group the prevalence of a number of hard bands, abrasive material, such as the cemented coquina, the mudstone bands, and particularly the gravel in the Upton Formation. Unfortunately, these are very abrasive and they cause a lot of wear and tear on the cutting teeth, cutting tools on the cutting head. You can see here a cutting tooth here. It's fairly worn down, but it's on the right here, completely worn away. And the roller disc on the right here, we can see here this wear detector that indicates the amount of wear and tear that this material has undergone. So at planned intervals, we have to stop the Tbm, open a series of very small hatches and crawl into the cutter head. And this way, a lot of the tunnellers can change or replace the worn cutting teeth. It's also an opportunity for the geologist to crawl in there and inspect the geology in the tunnel face itself. It's hot, it's dirty, it's sweaty, and it's very difficult crawling into these confined spaces, but it's really worth it for the geology that's encountered. On the right here, we've got the mid-Lambert Hiatus. We can see the lower Shelley beds overlying the lower Mottle beds. Notice the absence of calcrete, though, in this case. But in place, we've got these burrows infilled with the lower Shelley bed material. In other interventions, we can see the laminated beds perfectly exposed and the lower Mottle beds. So now I'm going to finish off with just the breakthrough of the smaller diameter Tbm on the Frogmore connection tunnel from Wandsworth to Carnworth Road. You can see here the rotating effect of the cutter head. And that's what we get when we have a tunnel breaking through. So just to finish off, I'm going to summarize with a few key points. We've seen that the London Basin geology is highly variable. A lot of engineers think it's just London clay, but it's just not the case. You know, we've got the chalk, the clays, the gravels, the sands, especially the Lambeth group. We've seen how the geology influences the design of the shafts and the construction or the design of the Tbm cutter head. We've seen that the sequence contains significant hazardous features such as groundwater, hard bands of material, and more sinisterly, hypoxic gas within the Upton Formation. We can see that geological modelling is vital in advance of construction to predict the hazards that we're going to encounter. And lastly, and by no means leastly, construction geological logging, which really validates the ground model, but from which we learn an awful lot of evidence on the geology that we can't see from boreholes. So I hope that gives you a good overview of what the geology has been like during construction of the Thames Tideway Tunnel. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for an extremely informative talk about application of geological knowledge and engineering in development, but also very much about how sort of development and construction adds to our knowledge of geology. Yeah, I found that extremely interesting. Time for a few questions. First question I've got on here is are these lectures being recorded? And the answer is yes, there are recordings of them, and they will be available for some time after the festival's over, so people can come and listen to the lectures again if you've missed them or you want to go through in further detail. There was a question earlier which I lost from my system, but it was just asking about whether or not it was collecting sewage or stormwater, Tim.
Hi, Colin.
Hiya.
That question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're quite faint, but I can just about.
Hello, Colin. Just
Yeah,
an answer to that question. It probably collects both. What happens is that the sewage currently, well, within the existing sewer network, it actually gets flushed out by stormwater during heavy rainfall periods. So what comes out into the Thames is more likely a mix of sewage and stormwater.
Okay, thank you. Very quick question. Is it right that there's no Harwich formation at Kirtling Street?
No, it's not right. There's probably a very small layer of Harwich at Kirtling Street. It's probably about 100 mil thick layer. Blink and you miss it. It really was very thin at Kirtling Street, but it was there.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions about funding now. Who pays for problems caused by unexpected geology? Is that the contractors or us, by which I think the questioner means the taxpayer, presumably?
Good question. And that is one of the reasons why we have geologists on the project. The contractor, when they encounter difficult ground conditions, they're entitled to put a claim in for unforeseen ground conditions. But it's the client's geologist to argue the case that they should have foreseen those unforeseen ground conditions. So if the contractor has to change his method of excavation and can prove that, then he's entitled to reimbursement. It's not added on to the overall cost of the project, though. That cost is from a pot. I'm not too familiar with the economics of behind the scenes, but when we encounter difficult conditions, it does not increase the overall cost of the project. I think there's some sort of reserve fund to cater for unforeseen ground conditions.
Okay, and what is the do you know roughly what the construction cost is and how it's funded, where the funding comes from?
Yeah, about 10 years ago it was about £4.2 billion. That crept up slightly to about £4.4 billion at the commencement of excavation back in 2018. So it's about £4.4 billion.
Okay, what materials are the cutting teeth made from?
Carbon steel tungsten, I believe.
Okay. And what rocks are what is the gravel and sand? What rocks are they made of? If you can answer that one.
Well, the gravel is usually made of flint, silica. We have the gravel in the River Terrace deposits. That's all flint gravel. Most of the gravel is derived from the flint in the chalk. Say, for example, the gravel that we find in the Upner Formation in the base of the Lambeth group, that marks the flint is derived from the flint in the chalk, and I believe it marks the onset of the alpine orogeny when the Upner Formation was first deposited some 56 million years ago.
Okay, thanks. There's another question about where the recorded lectures can be found, and I think that will be through the website, but I'm sure that can be clarified by somebody later on. But if you go into the website, I'm sure you'll be able to, the GA website, you'll be able to pick them up through there. What thickness of shotcrete is sprayed to achieve sufficient support strength is the next question.
Good question. Well, we normally apply the shotcrete in different layers. So as soon as we dig away at the ground, it's really important to, once we've got our tunnel profile, we apply a 75mm thick layer, a sealing layer, and that stops the clay from drying out, cracking up and falling down. And then we usually put on another layer, 100mm thick layer, just to stiffen that layer, that sealing layer up, and then another 100mm layer. So it's at least 250 to 300mm thick, usually about 400mm thick after we've put all the layers of shotcrete on. But an initial 75mm sealing layer just to quickly seal the profile or the exposed ground and stop it from deteriorating, oxidizing and drying out.
Okay, that's great. We're going to have to stop in a second. I've got more questions than we've got time for. Perhaps, Tim, you'd be able to arrange to answer some of these in writing, and we can put them we can put them on the website in some form or other.
No problem.
I think this is the last question we've got time for because people have other groups they need to go to. It says they're saying there are a number of faults shown on the overall tunnel profile that you showed near the beginning. Have these caused problems, and have you discovered unexpected faults?
Nice question, because we're writing a paper on the faults. I didn't have time to describe those faults in any detail, but we're actually writing a paper on the structural geology that we've encountered during the investigation and the construction of the tunnel, and that will hopefully be published in the QJEGH sometime in the not too distant future. The faults haven't actually caused any problems for the tunnel boring machine. A giant tunnel boring machine the size that we've used just chomps through the ground, and they're very sophisticated machines. They will control any changes in the ground or any deteriorations in the ground mass caused by faulting. Towards the east, some of the faulting has given rise to enlarged fissures within the chalk ground mass, and these are potential problems for groundwater ingress. But we've managed to conduct successful grouting operations that have plugged up some of the larger fissures caused by faulting. So potentially they can cause problems. They are quite significant challenges to overcome, but with good engineering and ground treatment, we can mitigate the hazard they pose to construction works.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I think we've got to leave it there and move on for the other sessions. But that's been really fascinating. Thank you very much. And one of the comments I've got here under the questions is thank you for a superb geotechnical talk, and I think that perhaps sums it up. So Thank you very much, Tim. And if sorry if you've got a question there we've not had a chance to answer, but hopefully we'll be able to provide an answer, or I'm sure you can get in touch with Tim and pick things up in future. So thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.